Now we're down here towards the end of the annual hunting season, and great time. We're scouting. Missions are coming up. Our guys are getting out of the woods. You know, there's a lot of people that say my hunting season starts the day after the hunting season ends, and maybe a little bit extreme. I think some people like to throw that around, and it sounds cool to tell people, yeah, it starts right now. But really, whether it's you're scouting in January, February, March, great opportunity to look around the woods and trying to find where bucks bed on your land, where bucks bed on public land, where bucks bed on your lease land. Finding those buck bedding locations, to me, that's the most sacred spot in the woods. That's the most sacred location on any parcel. And let's face it, for the hunting season time, bucks in their bedding locations, there's a lot of lands that don't have that combination together. Those bucks are bedding off their lands. Now, I'll tell you what I do. Part of my career is I scout bedding areas, buck bedding areas, doe bedding areas for a living. I work on about 70 clients a year around the country, and I walk around the property just like on a property like this. Is a 50-acre parcel. My average client's about 100 acres. I have 50% of my clients are 60 acres or less, so I have a lot of small parcels. And what I'm doing when I'm walking through those woods is, of course, I'm looking for food plot locations, travel corridor locations, hunting stand locations. I think I've chosen and picked out over 10,000 stand locations since 2005 on close to 800 deer parcels for my clients. And so I'm putting it all together for my clients. I'm designing that property. And for that, one of the most easy spots and the foundation spots, we're looking for food, locating those food source locations and what can be done, how those food sources can be built. And eventually it gets back to you have food sources, doe bedding areas close to those food sources, and then buck bedding areas. So I look for a lot of buck bedding areas throughout the year. That's what one of those things I specialize in. And so I wanted to bring some of those clues that I find to you so that when you're scouting this winter, you can really try to make sense of some buck bedding locations and apply those to your hunting practices and to your habitat management practices throughout 2019 and beyond. And I really wanted to start down here in this valley because this is a pretty sacred spot to us. We do not go in this portion of this property right here because this is a major buck bedding area. It's down here low. You hear a lot of myths online and in videos, articles, whatever it might be, that bucks always bed high. And folks, that's one of the myths of buck bedding. If you're looking for buck beds in high locations only, you're going to be sorely mistaken, and it's going to hurt your hunting habitat practices if you're trying to build buck bedding areas up high. And I'm not saying that bucks don't bed up high. I think in all things being equal, there's a lot of times that a buck would choose to be and take that vantage point and being up high, but so do a lot of other deer. Just bucks, does, mature does, fawns, it doesn't matter. We're down here low today, and there's a great reason that bucks are bedding down here. You know, for one, they have the cover. It's thick, it's high stem count. This is an area where they are not during the summertime, and that's one major point, that bucks are not going to bed during the fall, typically where they bed during the summertime. This location right here, they would not bed here during the summertime. It's way too thick. They crash their velvet in here, and there's a pain associated with that, and they are not going to be in here during the summertime, crashing their velvet through this, ripping their velvet up. But this is a place they crave and love during the hunting season. We have a buck that we call Roy. He's a 6-year-old. We have lots of trail cam footage of him just right up here, and this season, all season. And I wouldn't be down here right now in early December if it wasn't for the fact that tomorrow's the end of muzzleloader season. And then as we go in, we have the doe season this weekend, and there's just not a lot of people hunting around here at this point. We might hunt 2-3 weeks from now, and this will settle down. This is an example of a buck bedding area down low. The reason is because most of the food is either a great distance away on this flat here, a quarter mile away or more, or all the food is up top. So when you have your major food sources up top, then the bucks are not going to bed high. You're going to have the does that bed up closer to the food source, which is typically, you know, you can't always say always, but you can when it comes to doe bedding and buck bedding with a reasonable amount of expectation that does are going to bed largely to a very high percentage next to their major afternoon preferred food source, and then bucks are going to bed behind them. You're not going to have bucks bedding between that first bedding layer and the food source. In that case down here, that's what this is right here. We have does bedding up high, There might be some young bucks in between, and by the time you get down to this thick bottom, this is where those mature bucks are going to bed. And it's all positioned by food. So that's very important to think about. You know, where are those major food sources? On public land down in Ohio, southern Ohio, great patches of greenbrier up on top. A lot of times with the southwest facing slopes, you found some good stands of white oak. So those were areas where those adjacent bedding areas, those flats, those benches, those thick high stem count areas, maybe there's even a clear cut, fresh clear cut back on the public land, then those does are going to bed next to those major food sources and then the bucks behind them. It didn't matter if those clear cuts are on the bottom, if that greenbrier was on the bottom on public land, if those acorns were on the bottom, then those bucks are going to bed up high, and then vice versa. So locating those major food sources, high or low, and then extending back, it's a great way to find where those mature bucks bed. And I can typically look at a client property and I can say roads are here, hunter access is here, houses are here, major ag field over here, major ag field 3/4 mile away. And you can start to narrow it down pretty quickly to a small area of 30, 40 acres out of 600 acres, where if a mature buck's bedding, he's going to be there because he's behind does, he's away from major food sources, and it has nothing to do with direction. And that's a second point. So you're locating your buck beds by food, proximity to does, and they're behind it. It doesn't matter what direction that is. We have a lot of great bedding areas in this location that scatter north, south, east, west. It doesn't really matter. It all matters where that major food source is, then the doe bedding, and then there's that buck bedding opportunity. And that brings up a third point. Direction doesn't matter. People say, you know, the bucks are always going to bed downwind of does. Well, that just couldn't be further from the truth. That means that those deer are always changing, always moving, and especially in these hills. You have bedding areas where deer are actually, again, locate those buck bedding areas by food. That second point, doesn't matter what direction. The bucks don't need to be downwind of the does. That's a big myth. Don't listen to that kind of stuff. And then thirdly, we have a lot of great bedding areas around here that I can think of. It just so happens it's this way, that face north. And you might have a hollow that's facing north with 2 points coming out. So this is facing north right here, and you'll have bucks that are bedding on this inner line right here, on this side, or on this side, depending on the wind. So I found a lot of areas where, you know, there's that myth that deer always bed on a south-facing slope. That's ridiculous, because if it's 10 degrees, 12 degrees, and you have 20-mile-an-hour winds, and they're coming out of the southwest after a front blows through, those deer are not going to be facing south. It doesn't matter what the habitat is, because they're exposed to frostbite. And there's a good chance that they can actually, deer lose their tips of their ears. They're just not going to do that. And so because of the winds and the movement of the winds, especially in the fall when it's cold and deer are getting out of the wind and they're trying to find shelter, then if bucks are always bedding downwind, that means that does are always moving because of the wind, and then bucks are always following them, so their bedding areas are always changing. And when you're in small property locations like this, where everything's slotted in and you have 30s, 40s, 80s, and 100 acres, then those deer are going to bed in consistent locations. Now you might have a buck that's bedding on a certain point because there's food way down low, and he's bedding on a bench that wraps around that point, a flat spot, and he's going to bed in that location. Maybe he goes on this side of the point when the wind's coming from this way. Maybe he flips around to this side when the wind's coming from the other way, but he's really only moving 50 yards. He's still staying in that same location. They want to get out of the wind. They want to slot in behind does. And then the food is going to establish that layers of major afternoon food sources, doe bedding, and then buck bedding. And if you don't have those major afternoon food sources, a lot of times you don't have that doe bedding and then that buck bedding alignment. UP of Michigan, lots of baiting going on up there. We just finished a hunt a couple weeks ago up there. And those deer, largely huge groups of, not huge groups because there's not a lot of deer, but major groups of does bedding adjacent to bait piles, large bait pile areas where you have a lot of drive-ins in the hardwoods, and there's a lot of people that hunt in those locations. Convenient to get to, convenient to drop off bait. You have those does bedding within 200 to 300 yards, and then we're hunting and shooting those bucks 3/4 mile to a mile back in the brush where they slot in. You find that if you're in big timber, big wilderness areas, the slotting in from bucks positioning themselves from major food, does could be 3/4 mile or more because they have that space and they will take it. They want to find that secure area away and be by themselves, and I find that takes place the older they get, the more remote and reclusive they are, and the more specific they are in their bedding locations all the time. Now, if you slot in northern Ohio, where there's very little cover and there might not be any cover for a mile in any direction, then you'll find that those deer might slot into where you have major food, does, and bucks, again, away from the does, away from the food source, but it might only be 200 yards away because that's all the cover they have. If they have cover, they take it. Pretty easy to look at a topo map of a public land area, look at small private parcels and narrow it down to say, I know this is major access for hunters. I know these are major food sources, whether they're white oak stands, acorns, oaks in the September, October early drop, ag fields, bait piles, food plots, whatever it might be. And then you can slot into where you say, okay, this is the first available cover. Those does are going to bed there. And I'll do that when I'm on client properties over and over and over again, where we can walk through the woods. We start here at a food plot. A lot of times start with food sources. We get into that first layer of woods, obvious doe bedding. Doe bedding areas meaning that there's lots of beds, there's different size tracks, there's different size beds. That's even easy to see in the fall. You can figure that out. Pellet size, all off the charts. You have big pellets, small pellets. And then you start to get back into those interior areas where you should find buck beddings. They're behind the doe beddings. You have enough layers of cover that you've found, and you look ahead in the brush, you see a little knoll in there. They're not going to bed in a flat or a valley. They're going to bed where it's on a little bit of a knoll so they can get a little bit of visibility. They might cheat to one side of a slight ridge. A slight ridge in lower Michigan might be 5 feet high. So they're on that slight backside to get a little bit of break from the cover. But you're positioning yourself and you're getting back into whatever direction it is behind those does and food. You look ahead and lo and behold, and you say, you know what, that could be a great spot for a buck to bed. And you go back there, you find 6 or 7 rubs surrounding a bed or a bedding area, and you found a buck bedding area, the most sacred area in the woods. That buck bedding area is not made by any certain habitat. It's made just by the fact of layering food, does, and then finally room for bucks. I'll go through one last major myth. You know, bucks aren't always going to bed facing south. It depends on where the food is and the does and everything else. They're not always going to bed high or low. It depends on where the food and the does are. They're not always going to bed in one direction or another. I've heard that they always bed with predominant southwest winds. They always bed in the northeast, so they can always hit those southwest winds going into a major food source in the afternoon. Folks, that is not true. It just depends on that layering. And finally, bucks do not need a canopy to bed under. Hinge cuts, canopies, you're expecting deer to bed under this canopy because there's a hinge cut there. Totally false. And you're not going to attract a deer to that location specifically just because there's a hinge cut and there's a canopy. In fact, there's a lot of areas in the north and big hardwoods and wilderness areas where deer are used to a lot of space and they're not used to confined areas, and they will totally avoid any hinge cut areas. And so hinge cuts, one, just on a side note, isn't appropriate for all properties and creating all buck bedding areas. But let's face it, if a buck needed a canopy to bed under, there'd be a lot of bucks that don't have anywhere to bed across the entire country. Creating canopy is not going to attract a buck to your area or on your land. Creating hinge cuts that create food and create side cover might create a buck bedding area, but that's a totally different story in itself. They need this thick cover like we are at right down here. I feel pretty invasive because, again, this is, a golden spot that we don't normally walk into, but we're not hunting here if we even hunt it on this property again for 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. We have plenty of time. I think the bow season runs to January 31st down here. But this is a major buck bedding. It's in a valley. It's got high stem count. It's well away from food. It's well away from does. And I'm not even going to tell you the direction it's facing because that really doesn't matter. So I hope that makes sense. I enjoy scouting buck bedding areas for a living. That's one of my favorite things to do on a client parcel is I want to get back in the thick cover and look for some bucks. I hope you can apply some of this information as you're going forward and scouting in your own scouting missions this winter. And maybe you say the hunt starts for 2019 the day after the season ends in 2018. Maybe you're hardcore like that. I'm not even that hardcore. But I love scouting buck bedding areas, and I hope these tips will help you find a major buck bedding area this fall that you can apply to your hunting and habitat practices.